It is the end of the 12th century BC. Civilization is on the brink of collapse throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Powerful kingdoms that existed for centuries, Mycenaeans, direct ancestors of the classical Greeks, Hittites from Anatolia, New Kingdom Egyptians, and others, faced an unprecedented storm. Trade networks collapsed, hunger engulfed the lands, palaces burned, entire cities were abandoned. Mysterious sea peoples ravaged the coasts while internal uprisings tore kingdoms apart from within. Written systems disappeared, complex economies collapsed, and the memory of centuries of knowledge nearly faded. What historians call the collapse of the Bronze Age was not just a crisis. It was a kind of reset, a reboot of human civilization. Reboot from the ashes of which, centuries later, will arise what we now call classical antiquity, Greece, Rome, and the world we inherited. But not before going through very dark times, when life was extremely unstable for all who endured those turbulent and grim years. Can you imagine what it was like to live in this terrible dark time? What is it like to never know if your city or small state will survive the next attack, the next invasion, the next famine, the next plague? Will your children survive after your death? Will your people remember how to write in their own language? These worries and fears would certainly leave you with little chance for a good night's sleep. Therefore, the Mycenaeans or early ancient Greeks would likely be pleased with today's video sponsor, Mantle. Mantle offers the best sleep masks on the market. They are incredibly lightweight and comfortable for optimal rest. A mask that feels as if it was made specifically for your face. Eye cups, straps, and even tension. All infinitely adjustable for a perfect fit. It provides complete darkness even in bright daylight, so your quick nap is not interrupted by a single ray of light, and you don't have to press on your eyelids or eyelashes, which has always been a problem for me. But the Mantle does it brilliantly. And for those who sleep on their side, let's be honest, that's probably most of us, even the ancient Greeks. The Pro version is designed with cups shaped like the letter C, and air cushioning that sinks into your pillow, but still blocks all light. And thanks to this, even when you turn, it stays in place. All of this is made from high-quality, breathable fabric, modal cups, ventilated materials that keep your face cool and are so soft that you forget you are wearing them. So, although the Mycenaeans did not have sleep masks for the Mantle, you can truly have one if you want to support your strategic genius. If you write, play, or simply try to imagine how sea peoples storm beaches in your dreams, consider the possibility of acquiring a sleep mask from Manta. Now let's return to our alternative version of the Mycenaean story. How could the Mycenaeans survive after the collapse of the Bronze Age? To answer this question, we first need to understand what led to this massive collapse of civilization. Why did the Bronze Age collapse happen? Historians have been discussing this for decades. Some claim that the Sea Peoples, these mysterious invaders who conquered the eastern Mediterranean, were the spark that caused the catastrophe. Others point to the prolonged drought and famine that paralyzed agriculture and weakened the kingdoms from within. The third focuses on internal uprisings, when the oppressed lower classes rebelled against the fragile economic system of the palaces. And of course, one cannot ignore the possibility that new military technologies, such as iron weapons, gradually made bronze obsolete, cutting off trade networks reliant on the import of tin and copper. In fact, it was probably the perfect combination of all these factors: external invasions, famine, economic collapse, and technological transition. But why did this particular catastrophe destroy the world of the Mycenaeans? The answer lies in the structure of their society. The Mycenaean kingdoms were under the control of powerful palace complexes led by kings known as wanaks, who managed not only politics but also trade, agriculture, and religion. These palaces were the heart of Mycenaean civilization, but also its greatest vulnerability. As soon as the palace was destroyed, whether by fire, invasion, or uprising, the entire administrative system collapsed with it. The centralized economy left little room for flexibility, unlike Egypt, where the Nile and a more stable bureaucracy existed, or Assyria, which was still rising. The Mycenaeans had no reserves. As soon as the palaces burned, the system collapsed. To survive, the Mycenaeans needed to adapt as they never had before. The first step was decentralization. Instead of completely relying on the economy of palaces, power could shift to local fortified towns, smaller aristocracies, and regional councils, making their system less fragile in case one of the palaces falls. The second is military adaptation. Instead of being oppressed by the Sea Peoples, they could have tried to integrate them into their ranks as mercenaries, turning the invaders into allies, as the Roman Empire later did with barbarian tribes. The third is agrarian reform. If the drought really played a role, the Mycenaeans would have had to diversify their food production, perhaps by studying irrigation methods from the Egyptians or finding new trade partners beyond the Aegean Sea. And finally, technology. To adopt iron at an early stage rather than cling to bronze, which would give them a critical advantage in war and trade. If such changes had really occurred, instead of plunging into centuries of darkness, the world of Mycenae could have evolved directly into proto-classical Greece. Imagine that the heroes of Homer are not legends recorded centuries later, but real rulers of a continuous Greek state that has never fallen. This Greek state would enter the Iron Age not as a scattered group of villages, but as a surviving civilization ready to shape the Mediterranean for centuries ahead of schedule. Let's imagine that the Mycenaeans took one decisive step centuries forward. I believe this step was absolutely necessary for their survival: the invention of coinage. In our history, this was done by the Lydians in Asia Minor around the 7th century BC when they first began producing metal discs with a stamped value. But what if the Mycenaeans had done this out of necessity several centuries earlier, at the end of the 12th century BC and the beginning of the 11th? Such an innovation would have been revolutionary. Instead of relying on palaces to store and redistribute grain, bronze, or textiles, a system of coins would allow values to circulate freely. Farmers could sell their surpluses, craftsmen would be paid directly for their work, and soldiers or mercenaries could receive rewards in the form of currency that could be exchanged anywhere. In other words, the economy would no longer depend on the stocks in the palace. Coins would provide the world of the Mycenaeans with what it desperately needs in an era of crisis: flexibility. And here it relates to what we discussed earlier about decentralization. Remember, we talked about how the Mycenaean palaces were too fragile. When they burned down, the whole system collapsed. But in this alternative timeline, decentralization would become a mechanism of survival. Instead of a single central palace providing for the people, dozens of smaller fortified cities, aristocracies, and councils would take on this role. But if this is combined with a coin-based economy, suddenly a world emerges where all these disparate cities can continue to trade, collaborate, and maintain a common identity even without a palace controlling them. Over time, what began as a survival mechanism, decentralization with coins, could transform into the foundation for something greater. When coins start to circulate and normalize, they create a uniform economic system throughout Greece. Farmers in Messenia, merchants and thieves, as well as warriors in tyranny, all use the same currency. Once people start using the same money, it becomes much easier to envision them under one state. Political unity will ultimately follow economic unity. Instead of city-states drifting apart as in our history, the Greeks from this alternative world could have adapted to cooperation much earlier. Here could arise a strong leader capable of uniting the Greek councils into one kingdom with local governors managing their regions, all under one crown. It would not be a fragile system of palaces, but a solid proto-bureaucratic state based on coins. In other words, it would be the kingdom of Mycenae in Greece, several centuries before the rise of Rome, unlike our actual history where the Greek world was divided into competing city-states: Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and others. In this alternative timeline, Greece becomes more like Rome, a united force capable of projecting its power outward. If the Mycenaeans could achieve this, the Greeks would not be known as a culture of eternal division, but as a symbol of unity and builders of empires. Their development would look much less like the city-states of the 5th century BC, and much more like the Romans after their city was sacked by the Gauls. A centralized expansionist power building its legacy not on isolation, but on cohesion. Now let's think about how this alternative Mackinac kingdom could expand once it recovered from the collapse. In our real history, the Greeks of the Archaic Age settled throughout the Mediterranean, establishing colonies from Sicily to Spain, often out of rivalry or despair. Corinth, Athens, Megara, and others all competed for the chance to fly their flags far from home. But in this alternative scenario, such fragmentation did not occur. There were no rival city-states sending their settlements abroad to escape the shadow of neighbors. Instead, under the centralized kingdom, Greek expansion would focus near its native shores, ensuring control over the Aegean Islands, the coast of Asia Minor, Thrace, and ultimately advancing into the Balkans and Anatolia. What would truly distinguish this Mycenaean kingdom from its neighbors would be the innovations we have already mentioned, such as coins and administration. By the year 1000 BC, Greece would be using minted coins as the basis of its economy. This would undoubtedly send shockwaves across the eastern Mediterranean, The Phrygians in Anatolia, still consolidating their kingdom after the fall of the Hittite Empire, would quickly realize that if they wanted to trade with Greece, they would have to accept Greek coins. This alone would put the Phrygites in a subordinate economic position, even if they remained politically independent. Meanwhile, Egypt was entering its third intermediate period, a time of weakness, division, and decline. For them, Greek coins would become not only convenient but necessary, as their merchants and officials would have to use them in trade. Ironically, the once powerful Egyptians would find themselves dealing with money engraved with Greek symbols. And I say ironically, because we all know how the Greeks would significantly influence the Egyptians in the future, to the extent that they would politically govern them for centuries in our timeline. The Phoenicians certainly represent one of the most interesting cases. In our timeline, they became great navigators and traders of the first millennium BC, spreading throughout the Mediterranean and ultimately founding Carthage. Here, they would likely have integrated Greek coins into their trade networks. Moreover, they could be the ones to spread the Greek currency to the west, to Sicily, Sardinia, and beyond. In other words, the Phoenicians acted as catalysts for Greek influence, transferring Minoan wealth across the seas they had mastered, thereby compensating for the lack of Greek presence in the Mediterranean through indirect influence in the form of their trade and economic innovations. Finally, one must consider the Assyrians. Around the year 1000 BC, they were still recovering. However, by 900 BC, the Neo-Assyrian Empire began its expansion. The Assyrians built their empire on tribute, demanding wealth from their vassals. But what will happen if this wealth starts to be measured in Greek coins? Even the great kings of Assyria may reluctantly have to acknowledge Greek standards if their Western subjects are already paying with coins. This will give Greece a unique soft power that no army can resist. However, influence alone does not define a warlike nation. The Minoans were true warriors, and once their homeland becomes secure, they will naturally turn their gaze to foreign lands. Their first true opponent will not be Egypt or Assyria, but the Franks from central Anatolia. Both cultures developed simultaneously, vying for control of the rich shores of Western Asia Minor. In simple terms, conflict was inevitable. In the west, Greece will dominate over the Aegeans. In the south, Egypt will become a partner, not a threat. In the east, Assyria will represent a distant but powerful rival, which Greece can confront thanks to naval superiority and a network of economic influence. Meanwhile, the Phoenicians will compete, but in the process they will further spread Greek wealth and influence. Thus, by the beginning of the first millennium BC, in this alternative timeline, Greece is no longer a fragmented land doomed to centuries of oblivion. It becomes the first post-collapse superpower of the Eastern Mediterranean, a kingdom with economic hegemony, military potential, and a homeland that is stronger and more united than ever before. So where does this alternative Minoan Greece head next? In the 9th and 8th centuries BC, our united Minoan kingdom will be ready for expansion. Their first real enemy will be the Phrygians, who will ultimately fall under pressure. Possessing a coin system, centralized administration, and a disciplined military culture, the Minoans will not only match the Phrygians on the battlefield, but will ultimately surpass them. Western Anatolia, from Ionia to Troy, will be firmly under the control of the Minoans. The dream of controlling both sides of Ionia will finally become a reality. From this moment on, expansion will occur pragmatically. Unlike the scattered colonies of our real history, this Mycenaean state will focus on the regions directly surrounding its homeland: Thrace, Epirus, and Macedonia. The lands that in our timeline became rivals or late followers of Greek culture will instead be early absorbed by a unified Mycenaean state. Here we find one of the great butterfly effects. Macedonia, as we know it, will never arise. Without Macedonia, there will be no Alexander the Great, as their homeland will already be integrated into a stronger, previously united Greece centuries before their birth. The expansion will move north into the Balkans, securing trade routes and raw materials, while southern Asia will remain firmly Greek. However, although military conquest will define their northern border, Mycenaean influence will spread even further through trade. Egypt, fragmented and weak, will depend on Mycenaean coins for stability. The Phoenicians, even as rivals, will carry Mycenaean money westward to Sicily, Sardinia, and beyond. And through this economic network, the Mycenaeans will shape cultures that were never directly governed and had no presence. For example, the Etruscans, who in our timeline drew much inspiration from the Mycenaean colonies in Italy, will still be affected by this influence, but not through scattered city-states, rather through a flow of Mycenaean goods, symbols, and coins. Even the Latins living in their small villages on the hills of central Italy will see and absorb these innovations: coins, architecture, myths, art, and much more. In this alternative world, the Mycenaeans will still inspire what will later become Rome. But Rome will likely grow in the shadow of a giant that never fell during the collapse of the Bronze Age. Thus, by the year 753 BC, the traditional date of the founding of Rome, the Mediterranean Sea will look completely different. Instead of fragmented Greece, divided into competing city-states, we will see a united Mycenaean kingdom, a state that survived the collapse of the Bronze Age, centralized its power, and built a system that made it the first great hegemon of the Iron Age.